Imagine you arrive at Gettysburg expecting the tidy certainties of textbooks, lines on maps, regiment names, dates stamped in ink, July 1st through the 3rd, 1863, an event boxed into 3 days of tactics and sorrow. But what if I tell you that beneath the plaques, monuments, and soldierly roll calls, this ground keeps a different kind of ledger, one written in footprints that don't fit any blueprint in the record, in objects that look older than the town itself, in stories that refuse to be neat. That's the bargain of this hour together. We begin at a place most of us think we already know, only to discover a dozen doors that lead someplace stranger. I promise that by the time we step away from these fields you will have seen Gettysburg as a crossroads not just of Civil War strategy but of deeper, older mysteries, geological anomalies that hum beneath your feet, artifacts whose origins puzzle specialists, old maps that don't line up with modern surveys, and local tales, half-remembered, often whispered, that keep insisting on a past the textbooks don't mention. We'll talk in plain language, you and I, and we'll balance skepticism with a sense of wonder, because the best mysteries demand both a careful eye and an imagination willing to walk at dawn down a fog-bound lane. We'll also keep a scientist's respect for data. When dendrochronology, LIDAR surveys, or soil cores have something to say, we'll listen. But we will not pretend every question has been solved. In fact, the point of what follows is precisely this: some things remain stubbornly unsolved, and the stubbornness is worth our attention. Picture, if you will, fog clinging to the fields as a dawn chorus of cicadas recedes. The sun climbs in narrow bands that cast long soldier-shaped shadows across low stone walls. A wind comes up that sounds, if you let it, like distant marching. Now imagine, beneath those folds of smoke and sunlight, a field anomaly, a series of low mounds that local farmers once avoided, claiming their plows struck nothing but resistance, or an oddly worked stone embedded in a fence post that has tool marks not found on 19th century implements. Imagine we take a metal detector, or better, a trusted geophysical survey, and find concentrations of metal where no battle accounts place skirmishes. Or we take a coring auger and pull up pollen layers that hint at a landscape different from what the earliest maps show. These are the small clues that add up to big questions scholars, amateur sleuths, and old-timers have argued about for decades. We will travel around the cemetery and the ridges, yes, but we will also step off the beaten park roads, into hedgerows, into tree lines, across creeks, to places the guidebooks seldom mention. Along the way we'll meet the archive, 19th century journals, whispered family histories, deeds scratched onto yellowing paper, and the odd postcard of Round Top made for tourists in 1910. We'll also meet modern instruments, LIDAR images that peel away the forest canopy, revealing terraces and hollows that look like human handiwork, ground-penetrating radar maps that show seams in the earth that don't correspond to known graves, and isotopic analyses of metal shavings that suggest trade routes or metallurgical techniques out of place for the town's recorded era. But here's where it gets tricky. Data can point in multiple directions. One layer of charcoal in a soil core might mean a settler's hearth, a stray campfire, or the remnant of a pre-colonial clearing burned by indigenous peoples centuries earlier. A carved stone could be an early settler's marker, plain and practical, or a much older lithic modified by a culture long gone from these hills. Now, let's be fair. Gettysburg is saturated with the Civil War, its ghosts, soldiers' names, monuments, so anything older or stranger tends to be overlaid by later history. That overlay is part of the mystery. Later human activity buries, masks, and sometimes preserves older traces in ways that make them harder to read. We will examine multiple competing theories for each puzzle we encounter, some sensible, some speculative, and a few downright mythic. In every case, I'll tell you the primary data, what experts make of it, and why other readings persist despite the evidence. We'll talk about abandoned quarries and prehistoric earthworks, about giant skeleton stories that enter our narrative through 18th century newspapers and survive reworded into modern ghost tour lore, about cursed stones that a family swears caused illness until they were moved, and about small human acts, like burying a beloved horse or hiding a memento during a raid, that create traces later misread. You will hear names, not to pin blame, but to follow trails: a surveyor who sketched a ridge line wrong in 1820, a tavern keeper whose ledger mentions strangers arriving with strange trinkets, a farmer who, when plowing, pulled bones from under a stone slab that later disappeared into a cupboard. You will also hear the scientific counterweights, radiocarbon dates, stratigraphic orders, and the patience of historians who prefer to let multiple forms of evidence converge before pronouncing a verdict. Still, for all the evidence we have, there remain places, anomalous soil layers, an artifact out of expected time, a map that refuses to align with coordinates, where the tidy story slips. That's not failure. That's the heart of what we want, mysteries that invite us to keep thinking, to keep testing, to keep imagining. And because stories thrive on the human element, we'll give equal time to local memory. Ghost tours are not mere entertainment here. They are a kind of oral archaeology, a way communities encode past traumas, small wonders, and moral lessons. A tour guide's nightly tale about a woman in gray walking the cemetery may be constructed for effect, but embedded within that tale can be a genuine, older story about a missing person, a mislaid grave, or an unexplained footprint. We will treat these tales as data of a kind, not literal scientific proof, but important windows into how people in the town have experienced and explained the landscape across generations. Throughout, I will invite you to picture scenes, stand on Cemetery Ridge at dawn and hear how the land feels before the park is full of buses, walk the low path by Plum Run where the creek bends and vanishes into a culvert, imagining a different river path 1,000 years ago, or the soft tread of moccasined feet long before the first musket reports. Step into a farmhouse attic and find a box of odd beads whose glass composition traces to a trade route as far away as the Caribbean or the Netherlands. These are the scenes that let us move from cold facts to felt questioning, the very place where history, myth, and science meet and sometimes argue. We will also pay attention to scale. When we speak of ancient, we will try to be precise. Sometimes, ancient means pre-colonial by a few hundred years. Sometimes it means artifacts that might be thousands of years old. Other times it refers to landscape processes that are older still, the very soil horizons that took millennia to form. I will give you dates when they are reliable, so you will hear, for example, of pollen sequences that suggest a change in land use around 1,200 years ago, or a dendrochronology ring sequence that points to tree felling in the 1600s, and I will tell you how confident experts are about those numbers. And yes, we will talk about giants, lost tribes, and ancient voyagers, because mythic language is part of the landscape's storytelling tradition and because sometimes myth preserves a kernel of truth about encounters we do not yet fully understand. But we will also keep one foot in method. We will ask how a claim might be tested. If someone tells us there were giants, what would that mean archaeologically? What would we expect to find in the record, and does anything like that exist here? If a map suggests an old road that no longer appears on modern surveys, who else recorded that road, and does LIDAR or GPR, ground-penetrating radar, turn up consistent patterns? In other words, we will not be satisfied with sensationalism, but neither will we quickly dismiss the sensations that good evidence can later explain. By the end of this introduction, I want you to be as eager as I am to step onto those quiet trails, to lift a stone and peer down, to listen for what the earth will tell us. This is the first step of a longer journey. In the chapters to come, each a mystery in its own right, we will examine 6 to 8 of Gettysburg's most compelling enigmas, moving from the well-known to the nearly forgotten, from the scientifically tractable to the stubbornly uncanny. We will interrogate the archive and the field, the scientist and the storyteller, and we will always end each segment with a question that refuses to settle. Keep your skepticism close. Keep your imagination closer. And above all, keep your boots dry. We're going to places where the past is not only remembered but still makes itself known beneath our feet. A low ridge behind the battlefield, there, where the trees crowd close to the road, a series of low, regular mounds hides in the leaf litter. The ridge bears the quiet marks of something older than any Civil War map, and people have argued for a century about who shaped them and why. Picture yourself walking the foggy trail at dawn, boots sinking into the damp loam, and seeing those small rises, not dramatic like a pyramid, but subtle, measured, the sort of thing you might miss if you weren't paying attention. These are the earthworks that local antiquarians first noticed in the 19th century, small earthen berms laid out in patterns that, when mapped carefully, suggest intentional shaping, linear terraces, shallow bowls, and low walls that run for tens to a few hundred meters. Archaeologists who study the region tie features like these to the broader tapestry of the eastern woodlands, communities who, between roughly 900 and 1400 CE, built mounds for ritual, burial, and community cohesion across the eastern United States. Yet here, at the margins of a town famous for its 3 days of battle, these formations don't fit comfortably into the clean categories we use for prehistoric earthworks. Some are too small to be typical platform mounds, others lie in positions that conflict with known settlement patterns. Measurements matter. One terrace runs roughly 130 meters and is about 1 to 1.5 meters high, too low for a defensive work and too deliberate to be a mere result of erosion. When students of the land first surveyed the area, in the late 1800s and again more thoroughly in the 1970s, they found artifacts in the plow zone, flakes of chert, a few pottery sherds with cord-marked patterns, a bead of marine shell that would have had to travel a long route to reach this hill. Those key finds suggest links to regional trade networks, the same currents that brought copper from the Great Lakes and marine shell from the Atlantic to inland plazas. But here's where it gets tricky. The stratigraphy, the order of the soils, tells multiple, competing stories. In some cores, the mound sediments sit above a charcoal-rich layer dated, by local radiocarbon runs, to roughly 1,200 years ago, consistent with late woodland construction. In others, the profile suggests repeated episodes of human activity over centuries, possibly punctuated by later disturbances from colonial-era plowing and 19th-century military entrenchments. Now, let's be fair, disturbance does not negate antiquity. A place can be used and reused across ages. A bench made by one people can be reshaped by another. Still, for all the evidence, disagreement persists. Some scholars say these are small ceremonial platforms, local expressions of mound-building behavior adapted to the ridge's geology. Others argue they are agricultural terraces, raised beds made to manage rain and soil on a slope, perhaps evidence of intensive pre-colonial horticulture. Yet a third camp suggests their natural periglacial features misread as human-made, ancient freeze-thaw patterns that now only look intentional because our eyes seek order. Complicating each theory are those stray, sensational elements that refuse to be banished from the conversation, accounts from turn-of-the-century newspapers describing giant bones, turned up by farmers, and a local family story about a stone slab which, when lifted, revealed a cavity containing a cache of work stones and a single battered metal ring whose alloy later testing could not match 18th or 19th century iron. Ghost storytellers loved to spin these into images of lost tribes and titans, giants whose bones once bristled like the ribs of mountains. We must treat such tales carefully. 19th century reporting often sensationalized finds, and old metal finds can be intrusive, left by a later lost visitor, stolen from another site, or even planted. Still, mythic language persists because it answers a human urge to make the strange understandable by making it spectacular. Picture yourself at noon, stepping off the path to examine a shallow bowl in the earth with your hand, and sensing that this ridge was not simply a place to pass through, it was a place chosen. What would that choice tell us? That a community gathered here for seasonal rites, watching the valley and its river corridor? That a band of travelers marked a stopping point in a network that stretched from the Chesapeake to the Ohio? The artifacts give us threads to follow, pottery tempering that hints at a local clay tradition, a worked chert fragment whose lithic characteristics match quarries miles away, a shell bead whose chemical signature suggests an Atlantic origin. Each piece nudges us toward a narrative of connectivity. Still, for all the scientific tools we bring, radiocarbon assays, microscopic soil analysis, LIDAR scans that strip the canopy away to reveal linearities, the features refuse to settle into a single neat story. LIDAR, in particular, has been a revelatory technology. Where dense foliage once hushed the ground, airborne laser returns outline terraces and shallow depressions with a brutality that makes previously invisible things visible. In this landscape, LIDAR has shown us alignments that surprise, slight ridges that extend the visible mounds into patterns crossing modern property lines and even the edges of the national park. But here's the rub: some of those alignments line up with 19th century fence lines and early roads. Did later land use exploit older features? Or did surveyors and farmers inadvertently produce the pattern LIDAR later revealed? The poor visibility of the record makes us play detective with half the clues in our pockets. Now, let's be fair to the patient specialists who refuse sensationalism. A careful excavation of one of the mounds produced nothing like the rich burials of platform mounds elsewhere. There were no caches of exotic goods. Instead, modest deposits, charcoal pockets, the occasional pottery base, and post-hole stains that hinted at small structures. That suggests localized, possibly seasonal activity, groups that camped, cultivated, or held ritual rites without the centralized hierarchy you'd expect in a mound builder chiefdom. Yet local memory has its own stubborn persistence. Old families tell of a council stone near the mounds where elders once met, and in one oral account, a traveler from the early 1700s described seeing a ring of posts on the ridge, an observation that, if accurate, pushes human use of the site before European settlement. Such descriptions are tantalizing but slippery. They must be tested against material evidence. Multiple competing theories persist because the data cover a long time span, because later human acts have blurred earlier signs, and because sometimes the most likely explanation, agricultural terrace, or pre-colonial campsite, feels disappointingly prosaic against the human hunger for wonder. Still, for all the evidence we have, the site keeps its questions. Who chose this ridge and why? Did this place sit on a minor trade artery, secret at first but significant in aggregate? Did people ritually use the ridge in ways that left faint, repeated traces rather than singular grand monuments? And what about the fewer sensational finds, the bones in the ring, and the rumors they spawned? Do they point to an isolated burial disturbed by later plowing, or to some older story that never made it into the written record? These are the questions that make fieldwork hum with argument. Finally, step back and feel the human scale. Imagine a child, 1,000 years ago, running a hand along the low wall of compacted earth, or a mother picking seeds from a pounded hearth while smoke drifts across the nearby valley. Small human moments that leave little in the stratigraphic record but everything in the human imagination. These vignettes remind us why we keep looking, because beneath the ordinary, history accumulates in ways that sometimes require patience to read. We will keep peeling back layers with better tools, and yet each new dataset seems to multiply the puzzles. We still don't know. There is a narrow creek that winds through the lower fields, Plum Run to many, the wheatfields wet seam, whose course has been rewritten more than once by both nature and human hands, and whose banks hold stories that refuse to settle into a single neat explanation. Picture the creek as it moves now, a sleepy ribbon, its water low in summer, flanked by stone walls and the occasional rusting fence posts. Then imagine it a few centuries back, braided and vigorous, changing channels after storms, nourishing marshes that drew animals and people alike. The one-sentence truth that haunts this place is simple. Plum Run hides evidence that the waterway we see today is not the same river our ancestors walked beside, and the traces of those changes whisper of people, climate shifts, and perhaps deliberate rerouting. The historical context is crucial because waterways shape settlement and movement. The valley here is part of a larger drainage that funneled resources, fish, game, fresh water, into the lifeways of the eastern woodland peoples long before European contact. By the 17th and 18th centuries, colonial maps begin to show a named stream, mills clustered where flow and fall could be harnessed, and land grants referencing marshy meadows. By the early 1800s, local deeds document a mill on Plum Run, at a drop of roughly 3 to 5 meters over a short distance, measurements that mattered to early industrial entrepreneurs. Then the Civil War arrived and reshaped both landscape and memory. Artillery churned the banks, hastily dug earthworks altered drainage. Men fording the stream left artifacts that littered the mud. When hydrologists, archaeologists, and odd-job local surveyors have studied Plum Run in recent decades, they found a complicated palimpsest. Sediment cores pulled from a single oxbow near the wheatfield show alternating layers, alluvial sand and gravel indicating high-energy flow events, dark organic rich silt suggestive of marsh accretion, and thin bands of charcoal and ash that, when radiocarbon dated, fall into at least 3 clusters, one cluster circa 1200 to 1400 C, another around the 1600s, and a third in the early 1800s. These dates hint at episodic flooding and burning, maybe controlled burns to maintain open foraging areas, perhaps larger climate swings that altered groundwater tables, or the byproduct of human activity like mills and forges. But here's where it gets tricky. Some of the artifacts in those same cores do not fit neatly into local histories. Embedded in a silted layer that radiocarbon dates to roughly the early 1500s was a tiny sliver of worked glass whose chemical composition, tested against known signatures, most closely matched European glass-making recipes of the late 15th to early 16th centuries. That raises immediate questions without easy answers. European glass at that date in the interior of Pennsylvania would be surprising. Is it intrusive, carried into the layer by later burrowing animals, or mixed by plowing, or is it a rare trace of early contact, perhaps via coastal trade networks that moved beads and small items far inland? Multiple competing theories have been proposed. One argument insists on straightforward taphonomic processes, sediments mix, and small durable items move from higher to lower layers over time, especially in floodplain contexts. Another suggests a route of post-contact exchange sooner than commonly assumed, where European goods permeated native trade routes and ended up in places we don't usually expect. A third, more speculative, reads the presence of such items as evidence of earlier, poorly documented voyages or lost traders who penetrated inland ahead of recorded maps. Now, let's be fair, the scientific process favors the first explanations until extraordinary proof appears. But the mere presence of anomalous material in an otherwise coherent sequence fuels imagination and local myth. Stories proliferate. One old account from a township historian tells of a farmer in the 1890s who, while dredging an overgrown channel, found a wooden box sealed with pitch and a strip of lead. The box later disappeared into private hands, its contents supposedly including a rolled parchment with illegible script and a brass token stamped with a cross. Skeptics point out the likely provenance. The token could be a Civil War medallion, the parchment a misremembered map, and the story amplified with each retelling. Yet these stories matter because they shape how communities engage with the creek, as a place of hidden things and continuing mystery. Hydrological modeling adds another layer of complexity. Using historical topographic maps, early road surveys, and the scant records of mill owners, geomorphologists reconstruct possible former channels and infer that Plum Run's main channel may have shifted as much as 200 meters in places across the last 6 centuries. Where the creek once braided might now be dry meadow. Where a marsh once taxed the soles of deer might now lie a soldier's shallow trench. The implications are important. Shifting channels alter where people camp, where cemeteries are dug, and where artifacts end up. When GPR, ground-penetrating radar, surveys were run in one meadow adjacent to the stream, technicians expected to see sedimentary layering and perhaps tree throw features. Instead, the radar reflected a series of regular, linear anomalies, suggestive not of random geology but of human-made channels or drains running perpendicular to the current stream. If these are anthropogenic, their scale, trenches 1 meter wide and a half-meter deep, running for tens of meters, suggests concerted labor. Who dug them, and why? The competing theories proliferate. Perhaps they are millrace-related trenches, engineered in the 18th or 19th centuries to divert water to a mill wheel. Or perhaps they are drainage works by early agriculturalists, designed to render the floodplain more cultivable. A bolder interpretation posits that some trenches align with Native American earthwork practices, small irrigation channels built to support horticulture. Each interpretation has supporting and contradictory evidence. A nearby 1790 deed notes a mill to be built by the Derrickson lot, giving weight to the millrace theory, yet the orientation of the anomalies does not match mill plans recovered from 19th century maps, and the earliest mill foundations exposed during archaeological trenches date to the 1820s, later than the lower sediment dates for some anomalies. Again, we must respect the data and the ways it complicates tidy narratives. Then there are the more sensational elements that the public loves and that folklore amplifies. There is a local tale, told in low voices on ghost tours, of the vanishing bridge, a plank span that, during a moonless night in the early 1800s, bore a wagon of mysterious cargo that disappeared in a fog bank and was never seen again. 19th century newspapers delighted in such stories, mixing fact and fancy, and some versions claimed the cargo was full of carved idols and giant bones. For historians, these claims are unfalsifiable without artifacts. For amateur explorers, they are invitations. On a practical level, what is less sensational but perhaps more haunting is the way Plum Run sediments preserve the rhythms of human life: hearths, butchered animal bones, a scatter of European iron nails, small hooks, perhaps a musket fragment, each tell overlapping, not singular, stories. In one dig, archaeologists uncovered a hearth lined with fire-cracked rock and a scatter of charred maize kernels. Adjacent to it lay a drilling fluted point stylistically dated to a pre-contact tradition. That juxtaposition suggests continuity of place. People return to favorable campsites across centuries, leaving a palimpsest rather than a clean break. A reflective insight comes into view here. Waterways are timekeepers, and their shifting courses trap fragments of choice and chance. A child's toy washed downstream during the Civil War may lie beside a prehistoric scraper because floods braid human lives just as they braid channels. In this way, Plum Run becomes a metaphor for the kinds of history we are most apt to misunderstand, the mixed and layered rather than the single-issue story. Imagine walking the muddy bank at dusk and seeing a slice of glass glinting in the silt, its edges softened by water, bearing marks that point to a maker across an ocean and a date centuries earlier than the nearest recorded settlement. Imagine, too, deciding what to do: pocket it and create an artifact of your own by removing it from context, or record its location and call a colleague to test its chemistry? The choice matters because context is everything. Removing the object sacrifices information in exchange for possession. That ethical tension, between curiosity and stewardship, sits at the heart of modern fieldwork. Scientists, mindful of both, proceed slowly, asking for more data rather than quick narratives. Still, for all the careful testing, radiocarbon ages clustered and recalibrated, isotopes compared to known glass signatures, LIDAR overlaying old mill maps, pollen sequences telling us when trees gave way to grasses, some questions remain irreducible. Did trade networks carry tiny, rare items inland centuries before we thought they did? Were landscape engineers here centuries ago, deliberately reshaping channels for cultivation? Or are we seeing the complicated byproducts of storms, human reuse, and the human appetite for pattern? The temptation to grand narratives is always present, lost treasures, secret passages of trade, but the steadier truth may be quieter and more profound. Plum Run records the small-scale labor of many different communities across centuries, and it preserves accidents that make history tantalizingly incomplete. We still don't know whether the glass sliver in the early layer marks true early contact, a later intrusion, or a hoax, whether the GPR trenches are millworks, irrigation, or something older, and whether the vanishing bridge story encodes an event we might someday corroborate, or whether it is simply a human way of narrating the uncertainty the creek always brings. There's an abandoned stone quarry on the north side of town, an old cut where the bedrock was once pried open and wagon loads of flagstone and foundation rock hauled away, and at first glance it seems like the kind of industrial scar you see on any old rural map: straight cuts, terraces, a pond filling the deepest pit. But this place hides something that people in Gettysburg have been arguing about for over a century. A solitary, roughly hewn boulder that lies half-buried at the quarry's lip, its face incised with shallow grooves and shapes that refuse to read comfortably as either natural fracture or modern graffiti. One-sentence teaser: the quarry boulder bears marks that may be an inscription, a map, or a message from a hand older than the town itself. Picture yourself climbing down the quarry trail at dusk, the whisper of the pine needles under your boots, and the air smelling faintly of damp rock. You reach the boulder and run your fingers along its weathered face, feeling the shallow gouges where lichen has settled into the grooves like ink. The historical context matters because stone extraction here has layers. Colonial era small quarries opened in the late 1700s to supply foundations for farmhouses. a more industrial phase around 1820 to 1850 sent dressed stone to nearby towns, and then the Civil War turned some quarries into makeshift burial pits and artillery supply dumps. Survey notes from the 1790s record a hard limestone vein at the location. By 1845, a mason's ledger lists stone quarried at Black Hollow, sent for a courthouse foundation 3 miles away. Yet the carved boulder seems to predate, or at least to ignore, those utilitarian histories. Petrological analysis shows the boulder is a local feldspathic sandstone, matching nearby outcrops, not a glacial erratic brought from afar. Toolmark studies under a loupe reveal gouges that are neither the regular chisel patterns of 19th century masonry nor the random fractures caused by thermal stress. Some marks are shallow and parallel, others cross and angular motifs, and a few form a loose ring about 40 centimeters across, large enough for several people to stand within. Key discoveries deepen the mystery. Beneath a thin cover of soil near the boulder's base, an excavation in the 1960s turned up a scatter of small flakes, debitage, from stone tool production, several fire-cracked rocks, and a tiny cluster of shell beads whose chemical signature linked them to Atlantic mollusks. Those beads, 3 in number, were submitted for *14C associated context dating by association with charcoal. The charcoal return dates clustering around 900 to 1200 C. That strongly suggests human activity at the boulder well before colonial times. But here's where it gets tricky. The incised marks themselves weather in a way that suggests exposure for centuries, yet some of the shallow grooves have sharp edges that appear fresher, as if someone left more recent marks using a metal tool. How then to read the boulder's palimpsest? Are we looking at a prehistoric petroglyph later augmented by 19th century quarrymen, or a 19th century stone reused and reinterpreted by people who found older scraps at its base? Multiple competing theories have jockeyed for acceptance. One theory, favored by regional archaeologists, reads the marks as a form of indigenous rock art, abstract but meaningful motifs used by Eastern woodland peoples for ritual marking of place. In this reading, the ring could denote a ceremonial focus, and the intersecting lines could be clan or seasonal markers. The beads and charcoal bolster a narrative of pre-colonial ritual activity adjacent to a quarrying zone. A second interpretation takes a geologist's eye. Freeze-thaw and flaking of mica-rich layers can produce linear sorting and shallow grooves that, when viewed with a human pattern-seeking gaze, appear intentional. From this perspective, the flakes and beads are coincidental campsite detritus and do not prove deliberate carving. A third, more controversial hypothesis suggests post-contact reworking by early European settlers or even by Civil War soldiers, inscriptions added to a notable boulder as a meeting place or a boundary marker. Proponents of this third view point to faint iron staining within some grooves, arguing it comes from metal tools rather than stone-on-stone percussion. Now, let's be fair, each model has explanatory power and blind spots. The indigenous art theory explains the associated cultural material and the stylistic abstraction of the marks. It must, however, account for those apparently newer gouges. The geological model warns against imposing meaning on random patterns, but it struggles to account for the clear artifacts found in situ and the circular configuration that seems unlikely to be purely accidental. The post-contact augmentation model fits the iron staining but must explain the older charcoal and beads in direct association. And there are more sensational additions to the debate, those irresistible mythic elements that seep into local lore. A late 19th century pamphlet, part tourism brochure and part ghost story, claimed the boulder was a standing stone of the mound makers, and that removing a small carved chip once brought sickness to a family who tried to sell it in town. An elderly oral history passed down in one household tells of a reign of the giants, where the boulder served as a portal marker for enormous people who walked the ridge before recorded history. These narratives are not archaeological evidence, but they tell us about how communities shape and preserve meaning. Giant tales condense awe into scale, while curse stories police the boundary between the sacred and the profane, discouraging relic hunters in a way that sometimes protects the very contexts researchers need. Technological tests have complicated and clarified in equal measure. High-resolution 3D scanning of the boulder reproduces the grooves with millimeter accuracy, allowing morphometric analysis of toolmark cross-sections. The resulting data show 3 distinct groove profiles consistent with 3 different implements: hard stone, soft stone, and a metal edge. Microscopic residue analysis in one groove found trace iron particulates and a faint organic film that could be plant oil used as a lubricant or could be taphonomic contamination from later use. In 2018, a graduate student's thesis compared the motif geometry with a database of Native American petroglyphs across the Mid-Atlantic and found some statistical similarity to ring and ray motifs used in ceremonial contexts, but the sample size was small and the fit not definitive. Ethnohistorical records provide tantalizing parallels but not direct proof. Early settlers' journals sometimes mention council stones or place-mark rocks in other valleys, but no colonial writer recorded a detailed description of the quarry boulder, and mapmakers of the 18th century tended to ignore specific surface rock features unless they mattered to property lines. This silence can mean nothing, or it may mean the boulder's importance was chiefly local and oral, not something a passing surveyor bothered to note. The social dynamics of interpretation also shaped the debate. Local amateurs, antiquarians with a taste for romance, have long favored the petroglyph reading, while professional archaeologists insist on caution. Occasionally these camps clash. In the 1930s, a volunteer broke open a shallow soft-weathered groove to reveal a deeper, apparently freshly carved mark. Newspapers seized on the discovery and called it proof of a lost race. That action destroyed context and illustrated the ethical tension between discovery and preservation. So what does the boulder mean to us? A reflective insight emerges when we consider the human impulse to mark place. Whether the marks are ritual, utilitarian, accidental, or a palimpsest of all three, they testify to attention. Someone cared enough to alter a stone face and to gather by it, whether for work, worship, or simply to rest. The presence of beads and hearthscatters suggests repeated human presence across centuries. People who return to a place with durable significance. Imagine, then, standing by the boulder at twilight with a small team of researchers and a local elder, the elder telling you of a grandmother's story that said no one should chip the stone, the researcher murmuring about toolmark metrics, and the students preparing to run portable XRF tests that will tell whether the shell bead's carbonate signature truly matches the Atlantic coast. Picture the way these perspectives, oral, scientific, and geological, brush and block one another, each revealing a facet of truth while obscuring another. And imagine the small human scenes, a pair of adolescents centuries ago circling within the ring as dawdling ritual, a mason in 1830 marking the stone for extraction then deciding it was too large to move, a soldier in 1863 etching initials as a vain claim upon a place already layered with meaning. These vignettes allow us to humanize what might otherwise be only lines on a scan. Still, the final knot remains stubborn. Even with 3D scans, residue chemistry, stratigraphic tests around the boulder, and comparative motif analysis, we lack the smoking gun, an in situ carved tablet securely datable to a discrete year or culture that would settle the argument for good. Interpreting palimpsest landscapes always means negotiating probabilities, not certainties. We can say what seems most likely given current evidence. Recurrent pre-colonial use later touched by colonial activities and perhaps by quarrymen, but we cannot yet stitch the narrative into a single, uncontested story. We still don't know whether the carved marks began as ritual petroglyphs, whether later hands added marks for boundary or milling reasons, or whether natural weathering played a larger role than any of us wish to admit. There are places in Gettysburg where the ground seems to keep a different kind of silence. Old farm fields where sod dips without obvious cause, hedgerows where clumps of grass grow thicker than the surrounding pasture, and small hollows behind stone walls where the air feels cooler even in July. In these places, over the last 2 centuries, people have turned up bones, not just the weathered femur of a cow or the rib of a pig, but human remains that puzzled the finders and sent rumor into motion. The one-sentence hook is simple and unnerving. Unmarked graves and reports of giant skeletons around Gettysburg have been whispered in local memory and printed in newspapers, and their meaning still resists a single explanation. Imagine you are a miller's son in 1857, leaning over the lip of a newly dug pond and staring at a long bone larger than any you've seen. Imagine, decades later, a plow blade hitting a stone slab and revealing a burial pit. Imagine the mixture of curiosity, grief, and the desire to explain that follows. The historical context is messy because the land has been reused many times for many ends: Native American villages, colonial homesteads, Revolutionary-era militia musters, early industrial mills, and fatally, the Civil War. Each use could leave burials, intentional cemeteries, battlefield dead hastily interred, or isolated graves that mark family tragedies. In the 19th century, newspapers relished the sensational and printed accounts of gigantic skeletons, discovered while rooting out a foundation or while digging wells. Some reports were careful, noting measurements and eyewitnesses. Others were breathless, the kind of copy that sells more papers than it instructs. Those sensational reports seeded folk memory. Key discoveries that anchored the discussion include 19th-century exhumations where bone dimensions were recorded, sometimes with crude measurements like a femur 2 feet long, or a skull broader than any seen in town. Local diaries mention bones reburied in cellar pits, a farmer who built a hearth atop a burial, and an undertaker called at odd hours to attend to remains found in a hedgerow. Archaeologists who later examined curated bone collections from private drawers and attic trunks found that many of the most sensational claims shrank under scrutiny: measurements exaggerated, fragments conflated into whole bones, and animal bones misidentified as human by well-meaning but untrained hands. But here's where it gets tricky: not every report collapses under examination. There are clustered finds, burial pits with multiple skeletons, articulated remains showing deliberate placement, and graves that predate recorded colonial settlement. Some bone metrics do indeed fall outside the range expected for the average historic-era person, but there are competing reasons why that might be so. One strong theory explains the phenomena in prosaic but important ways: taphonomy and the confusion of context. Soil movement, root action, and later human disturbance can displace bones, break them, and rearrange them. A femur broken in two and viewed from one angle can appear longer. A pelvis crushed and spread can look broader. Moreover, population health in earlier centuries was variable. Individuals with gigantism, severe rickets, or other pathologies did exist, and isolated cases could easily become legends when recounted without nuance. Another important theory says many of these burials are simply older Native American interments, some possibly from mound builder traditions or late woodland communities, whose grave goods and body treatments differ from European Christian burials. If a body were interred extended in a shallow pit long before a farmstead, later disturbance might expose it in ways that English settlers misread. A third theory, the one that makes the press and the ghosters giddy, entertains the possibility of a physically larger human population in the deep past, either due to genetic variants, now extinct lineages, or deliberate exaggeration by storytellers. This feeds the mythic image of giants, tall, wide-shouldered people who lived before us and left bones as proof. Now, let's be fair, thoughtful osteologists demand hard metrics. When a bone is found, the right protocol is careful measurement, comparison to osteological standards, and where ethical and legal, scientific dating like AMS radiocarbon on collagen. Too often in these old accounts, that did not happen. Bones were tossed in wagons, used as fertilizer, or reburied without examination. But sometimes later science caught up. In a mid-20th century case, a privately held, giant femur was donated to a small museum, measured by professionals, and found to be a robust but not extraordinary human femur, large, perhaps, but within the variation of a well-fed adult male, possibly someone with a genetic predisposition to height. Other cases were animal bones, mastodon and bison femora misidentified by excited finders. Still, a handful of puzzling instances remain. In one 19th century report, a burial revealed a set of bones aligned with an intentional cluster of river stones and a scattering of marine shell beads, an arrangement that looks deliberate and ceremonial and that, when dated indirectly by associated charcoal, hints at pre-contact antiquity. The size impressions here were not wildly outlandish, but were slightly larger than what later historic populations in the region averaged. competing interpretations exist, perhaps nutritional differences, ample protein from abundant riverine resources, produced occasionally larger bodies. Perhaps these are individuals with emphasized stature due to genetic outliers. Or perhaps the grave belonged to a revered person whose bones were monumentalized in narrative over time. Mythic elements intensify as stories spread. An early guidebook for travelers, published in the 1870s, included a short chapter on the stone graves, and repeated the giant skeleton story with a flourish. Ghost tour operators wove it into their night walks. The bending of a lantern reveals a stone slab that, if lifted, would show jawbones like horse teeth. These images sell fear and wonder, and they become part of the local identity. People come to Gettysburg not only for cannon and flags but for the idea that the land remembers other, stranger peoples. Archaeology pushes back with method and skepticism, but some of the most interesting scientific moments happen where method meets myth. Modern osteologists, applying isotopic analysis to bone collagen, can sometimes reveal diet, whether an individual ate more freshwater fish, marine resources, or maize, and that can explain stature differences. Strontium isotope ratios can indicate geographic origins. Did a large-bodied person grow up locally, drinking local water, or did they move in from far away? In a few modern cases outside Gettysburg where similar, giant, claims were made, strontium analysis showed the individual grew up hundreds of kilometers distant, suggesting migration or trade-induced mobility. That leads to another theory. Perhaps some anomalous burials belonged to non-local elites, visitors who traveled long trade routes, married into local groups, and left distinct bodies and grave practices. Picture yourself kneeling at the edge of one of these old pits at dusk, a field technician with gloves and a grid of string, gently brushing soil away from an articulated rib cage as a lantern flutters. Imagine the tactile hush of the moment. You can see how easy it is for a single image, a long bone, a broad skull, to alchemize into a legend of giants, particularly when retold by generations who know the land through stories more than through coroner's reports. That human capacity to fill gaps with grandeur is not dishonorable. It is part of how communities make meaning of the uncanny. A reflective insight surfaces. Our fascination with giants says as much about us as about the past. We are primed to see exceptional forms and to read them as evidence of otherness, both dangerous and sublime. The giant story lets us imagine scale, difference, and a past in which human bodies themselves carried the weight of myth. Yet practical ethics and respect for the dead impose constraints. Modern archaeologists approach such discoveries with reverence, mindful of descendant communities and laws like the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, NAGPRA, which require engagement, and often repatriation rather than museum display. That legal and moral framework changes how we interpret and disclose finds. What was once fodder for newspapers becomes the subject of careful negotiation with tribal authorities, a process that often reveals cultural continuity and sometimes undercuts sensational narratives. Still, for all the care, uncertainty lingers. We still don't know whether all reports of giant bones are simply misread fragments and exaggeration, which burials predate European settlement, and what their social meaning was. Whether any of the unusually large metrics correspond to non-local, healthy, well-nourished individuals, or whether some reports encode long-lost memories of peoples who lived on this land in forms our modern eyes have yet to fully appreciate. The graves and bones remind us of a deeper truth. The ground remembers in ways we are only beginning to read, and when a farmer's plow unearths a bone, it nudges us toward questions about identity, mortality, and the stories we tell to hold the past close. We will keep turning up pieces, measuring ostensible giants, and if we are wise, listening to both the science and the stories the land and its people insist on telling. We still don't know. There's a low, saucer-shaped hollow not far from Devil's Den where compasses and temperaments have both been known to wobble, a place locals call the Hollow of Iron, though maps refuse to name it anything so poetic, and the one-sentence tease is blunt. Instruments misbehave here, metal corrodes oddly, and the ground itself hums with a small, persistent mystery that refuses a neat explanation. Imagine approaching that hollow at dusk, the smell of iron and wet leaf mold in the air, your pocket compass suddenly dipping and turning as if the Earth had its own secret north. Imagine the hairs on your arms prickling when your cheap handheld radio stutters with a static voice no one can locate. The historical context is layered. The valley's bedrock owes its shape to millions of years of sedimentation and later glacial scouring, while human use has been intense from the 18th century onward. Ironworks, mills, and wartime salvage all left traces. 19th century industrialists scoured local outcrops for hematite and goethite. A short-lived bloom of small bloomery furnaces and forges in the 1790s through the 1820s sent blacksmiths and tinkers across the ridgelines, hammering ore and forging nails for a growing settlement. The Civil War added a different metallic grammar, scattered spent bullets, bits of artillery, and buried ordnance in chaotic, compacted pockets beneath breastworks and crossroads. When geophysicists and hobbyist magnetic surveyors later walked the hollow of iron, they brought tools attuned to the Earth's subtle breath. Flux gate magnetometers, gradiometers, and metal detectors tuned across frequencies. What they found was not a single, easy pattern but a counterpoint of signals, high-intensity magnetic anomalies concentrated in discrete patches rather than a random scatter, small spherical reflections that read to some instruments like lumps of high-density metal, and a low-frequency hum picked up on electromagnetic surveys that seemed to come from under a particular lens of clay. Key discoveries include a magnetometer transect that registered spikes up to several times background levels in an area just 10 meters across, GPR, ground-penetrating radar, profiles that showed shadowed lenses of high reflectivity consistent with dense objects or disturbed strata, and a few small fragments, corroded metal slivers, that local detectorists pulled and handed off to a university lab for analysis. Those slivers tested as high iron alloys with trace elements atypical for known Civil War ordnance. But here's where it gets tricky. The geologic context could also supply an answer. The hollow sits where local glacial action left a pocket of iron-rich glacial till, and later soil development concentrated oxides at a particular horizon. The chemistry of iron ores is notoriously variable, and localized pockets can produce stronger than expected magnetic fields. One competing theory, pressed by field geologists, insists the anomalies are natural, remnant magnetite-rich deposits reworked by soil processes and by human activity. For example, a 19th century blacksmith dumping slag produced the readings. Another theory, equally grounded, less mundane, points to buried human-made metal, ordnance caches, stashes of tools lost and left, or even a deliberate cache of metal objects placed by people centuries ago for reasons we cannot reconstruct. A third, more speculative hypothesis posits a meteorite fragment buried shallowly, and then partially oxidized, an extraterrestrial mass with metallic composition sufficient to disturb local magnetics. Each model tries to account for the instrument's antics and the sometimes odd behavior of metallic objects on the surface. A pocket knife that suddenly becomes difficult to close, iron nails that show pitting far beyond the corrosion expected for their age, or a lantern that dims in a specific spot while burning normally just a few meters away. Ethnography and folklore overlay these measurements with human meaning. Local tales, half ironies, half warnings, speak of a song you can hear if you sit very still, a low, metallic tone, a humming like a distant bell, that appeared at night long before tourists began carrying batteries and radios into the hollow. An old woman in town once told a reporter that her grandfather would not let his oxen graze there because the animals came home thin and listless after days within the hollow's bounds, a tale that sits uneasily with the data but powerfully with the imagination. Sensational accounts can go further. Legends of buried meteors evoked by a naturalist's postcard in the 1880s. Stories of magnetic madness, where a soldier's pocket compass guided him in circles until he walked into a stone fence. Sketches in Victorian travelogues that render the hollow as a place where the land forgets itself. We must treat such stories as cultural traces, not proof of a meteorite or curse, but evidence of how people experience a landscape that resists easy explanation. Scientific work offers other windows. Detailed soil chemistry in the hollow reveals pockets of acid iron pans and lenses enriched in manganese and iron oxides at shallow depth, features that can concentrate magnetic minerals. Micromorphology of thin sections shows that post-glacial colluvium and anthropogenic fill intermingle. The record is one of both deep time and recent disturbance. The metal fragments that labs examined contained unusual trace elements, like nickel or cobalt in proportions that, while not impossible for 19th century metallurgy, do not perfectly match known ordnance recipes. Metallurgists caution us, 19th century blacksmiths worked with whatever scrap arrived at their forge. Composition could vary from foundry to foundry. Thus, a unique alloy does not by itself confirm extraterrestrial origin. The meteorite idea, however romantic, requires extraordinary evidence, a compact mass with a fusion crust or distinctive isotope ratios that laboratories could confirm. In the hollow there is no such smoking crater or clean fragment, only mottled readings and small corroded pieces. Another layer of puzzlement lies in the area's electromagnetic interference. Amateur radio operators report static and short bursts of voice-like patterns when they pass certain points. Engineers testing the site measured low-level, irregular EM noise across a few hundred hertz ranges that do not correspond to nearby infrastructure. Could buried metal and soil chemistry produce such interference? Yes. Induced currents and local galvanic cells can create minute electromagnetic fields, but these are usually too weak to cause the audible phenomena locals describe. Some physicists note how human perception amplifies subtle inputs. In a quiet place, a faint hum becomes a song. In a place layered with ghost stories, a random squeal assumes meaning. Again, that does not settle whether the hollow's hum is purely psychological or grounded in measurable physics. It only reminds us to triangulate claims with instruments and human testimony. The social dynamics of the hollow complicate research. Detectorists, driven by the joy of the find, have often altered the site, digging small, informal pits that mix strata and scatter artifacts. Park managers are caught between protecting archaeological contexts and accommodating the economic benefits of tourism. When a private detectorist pulled up an odd corroded ring and posted a photo online, the thread quickly filled with speculation: ritual object, meteor fragment, Civil War charm. Scientists stepped in, and a careful sequence of sampling showed the ring's alloy matched typical 19th century iron with a rare impurity likely introduced by a small foundry's particular ore source. That finding calmed some speculation yet left others unsatisfied. Internet lore has a long memory. The sensory allure of the hollow, its humming, the compass tricks, the skin-prickling stories, matters because it is how people relate to place. Science gives us testable hypotheses: localized or concentration, buried ordnance, small-scale industrial debris, or nothing more than a complex overlay of geology and human detritus. Folklore gives us the motivations for keeping the place in story: to warn, to kindle wonder, to mark a place as other. A reflective insight emerges when we consider why magnetic anomalies terrify and fascinate us. Magnetism is invisible yet real, a force we sense only through proxies: a compass needle, a radio static, a wayward rabbit. When the landscape alters those proxies, it feels like the ground has its own mind. That sensation provokes stories because stories help us orient in places that disorient our instruments and our expectations. Picture yourself there at midnight with a bulb lantern and a friend, both of you laughing nervously as the compass needle spins, testing again. Imagine brushing aside leaf litter and finding a patch of black slag thin as crust, a small witness to past human heat. Imagine a scientist kneeling, taking a soil block and labeling it, the careful cataloging a kind of counter-ritual to the wildness of myth. These vignettes show how human curiosity treads between awe and method. Still, after decades of surveys, coring, metal analysis, and folklore collection, stubborn puzzles remain. We do not have a large meteoritic fragment with definite cosmic isotopic markers. We do not have a single, massive ordnance cache that explains all magnetic spikes. We do not have a geological map that perfectly matches the pattern of instrument anomalies. The likely truth may be a blend: natural iron-rich pockets enhanced by human slag and occasional caches of metal, their effects amplified in local perception to a humming that becomes legend. But we must be candid about our limits. We still don't know whether the hollow's most dramatic stories, vanishing compasses, audible singing, the sudden malaise of livestock, are all explainable by geology and small-scale metallurgy, or whether some features point to an extraordinary event buried and waiting to be understood. There is, tucked into old survey margins and shaded by a line of maples, a faint but stubborn trace, an old road that appears on no modern GPS, a swale that can be walked if you know where to step, and a set of surveyor's blazes on a stone wall that refer to distances in rods and chains. The one-sentence tease is this: beneath Gettysburg's modern grid runs an older web of pathways, routes that connected places long before formal town plats, and that sometimes carry artifacts and alignments that puzzle historians. Picture yourself standing in a narrow hollow where the asphalt gives up to dirt, where the ground dips and becomes a line of scrubby grass. Lay your palm on the packed soil and feel the fossil of passage, compacted earth that remembers 1,000 boots, 1,000 hooves. The historical context here stretches in layers: indigenous footpaths that followed ridgelines and high ground, colonial-era cartways that stitched farms to mills in the 1700s, and early American turnpikes in the 1800s that channeled wagons and stagecoaches. Surveyors' field notes from the 1760s mention a cart road near a stream and a stone bridge at a ford. By 1815 the road system is more regular, and by 1863 those same corridors became military lanes, funnels for supply wagons and for the movement of troops. Key discoveries in recent decades have come not from a single excavation but from an overlap of methods. LIDAR peels back forest canopy to reveal faint linear swales that match the alignments of 18th-century survey maps. Test trenches along a suspected roadbed turn up wheel ruts compacted into clay, fragments of coarse ceramics, and a scatter of iron horseshoe nails. And metal-detecting transects find concentrations of buckles and buttons, small personal items that suggest repeated human traffic rather than a single wartime incident. But here's where it gets tricky. Some alignments revealed by LIDAR don't match any documented colonial road, and a few stretch straight as if laid by a surveying eye across property lines that older maps don't reconcile. One compelling find is a stone alignment, stones set at regular intervals like waymarkers, that appears to cross a modern field in a line extending toward a hilltop where a cluster of mound-like features sits. Radiocarbon dates from charcoal under a roadbed layer cluster in two groups, one around 900 to 1100 C and another around the late 1700s. That suggests continuity of use, but the discontinuity between those dates raises questions. Did an older indigenous track later guide a colonial road? Were the stones repurposed across eras? Competing theories open like windows. One reading holds that old indigenous routes followed the easiest gradients, and that later settlers repurposed these natural highways, so continuity is expected. Another possibility posits that some straight alignments are colonial impositions, geometric in a European sense, cutting across older, curving indigenous paths. In this case, the LIDAR straightness is evidence of later surveying superimposed on older ground. A bolder hypothesis imagines pre-colonial engineered corridors, man-made causeways or drainageways, whose purpose shifted over centuries. These theories have different expectations. The first would predict a mix of pre-contact artifacts in the road's deeper layers. The second would expect clearer colonial-era fill and alignments. The third would seek evidence of planned construction, stone pavements, cut timber edges, that would stand apart from simple footpath compaction. Myths arrive like footnotes. A 19th-century homegrown chronicle mentions the Black Road, a route rumored to have been used by a vanished people who carried strange stones to the ridge. A later ghost tour recycles the tale into an image of shadowy figures passing at midnight and of a whistle heard on wind-heavy nights when leaves fall in straight lines. These images are not evidence, but they tell us how passage itself becomes destiny. Routes beget stories because places you walk become the places you imagine. A reflective insight forms at the edge of measurement. Roads are memory made durable. They shape where people live and die, where battles are waged and burials placed, and they preserve sequences of usage that compilers of maps can only hint at. When you stand on an old swale and trace its line with your eyes, you are following the choreography of countless human choices. Imagine an archaeologist kneeling in the swale, finding a wheel rut and then a flake of chert pressed into the rut's edge, evidence that someone on foot paused where a wagon later turned. Imagine a surveyor's chain passing over the same line in 1792 and an army wagon in 1863. each step and will add a new layer to the palimpsest. We still don't know, with certainty, whether all these faint lines are continuous inheritances from deep pre-colonial time, or largely the product of 18th century planning that later storytellers have gilded with older meaning. We still don't know if some alignments hide more formal, engineered structures beneath them, awaiting the day more comprehensive trenching might reveal timbers or stonework. The road's memory is patchy and insistently interesting, a reminder that even the most mundane infrastructure can be an archive when you learn to read it. There is one kind of mystery that always courts the theatrical, the ghost stories, the reported apparitions of uniformed soldiers, the sudden chill along a ridge, the flashlight beam that finds no living body but seems to meet a figure in the trees. The one-sentence tease is delicate and bold. Gettysburg's ghost stories are not only souvenirs of a single 1863 moment but, in many accounts, braided with older, non-military hauntings that hint at deep-time resentment, ancestral watching, or places that simply refuse to be settled by any single era's stories. Picture yourself on a night tour, lantern bobbing, the guide's voice soft as she tells of a gray-clad woman who walks the cemetery's edge. Some say she is a nurse, some say a mother, some say she is older still. The historical context is obvious and immense. The Battle of Gettysburg left nearly 8,000 men dead on the field and tens of thousands wounded, and the process of burying the dead, including hasty battlefield burials later consolidated into cemeteries, produced raw grief and a landscape saturated with violent memory. That saturation is fertile ground for apparition stories. But where the mystery deepens is in how some tales reach further back. A guide might tell of a figure seen before the park existed, of a marker stone that predates any Civil War account, or of a watcher on the ridge, seen by 19th century settlers who themselves spoke of older, pre-contact presences. These stories suggest continuity, that the land held meaning for multiple peoples and that some forms of presence, whether spiritual, cultural, or psychological, persist across cultural transformations. Key discoveries here are not artifacts but patterns of testimony documented across a surprisingly long archival chain. Diaries from the 1820s mention a woman singing by the old oak at dusk. Civil War soldiers' letters sometimes describe an encounter with a pale figure on a ridge that they associated with home. 20th century interviews with elders include descriptions of the river people moving at night. These testimonies differ in detail but converge on a core. People perceive figures in specific places, often where grief and layered histories concentrate. Competing theories attempt to explain these perceptions. One group treats them as culturally produced, stories created and perpetuated by communities to make sense of loss, to warn children away from dangerous places, or to attract visitors. Another, more psychologically grounded interpretation suggests that trauma shapes perception. Battlefield ghosts could be manifestations of collective memory, where the landscape itself cues certain emotional states that produce sensory experiences, coldness, a sense of being watched, or visual illusions in low light. A third, rarefied approach entertains metaphysical continuity, that places accumulate agency and occasionally replay or manifest past presences in ways not captured by material science. The last is the hardest to test, but it remains a powerful thread in local imagination. Mythic embellishments are abundant, tales of lost tribes returning on the anniversary of their displacement, stories of giant sentinels, whose footprints match depressions in the ridge, and accounts of a soldier who always appears to a family whose ancestor fought in a particular regiment. These narratives are not evidence in the scientific sense, but they are anthropologically valuable. They show how communities weave meaning, connect eras, and keep memory alive. The scientific response is cautious and compassionate. Ethnographers and historians approach such tales seeking patterns, not to debunk but to understand social functions. Psychologists study the conditions, time of day, weather, suggestion, that increase reports of apparitions. Photographers and videographers, often drawn to the haunted reputation, produce images that rarely, under scrutiny, survive the tests of exposure and artifact analysis. Yet the proliferation of images itself becomes part of the modern folklore, attracting more witnesses and more stories. A reflective insight emerges at the heart of ghost talk. these stories tell us as much about belonging and loss as they do about the past. They are a language for grief, for the difficulty of putting a violent past to rest. Whether the figures are spirits, memories, hallucinations, or a little of each, they function to bind communities to their land and to each other. Picture yourself one last time on a cool summer night, the chorus of insects loud as a drumbeat. You walk the ridge with a guide who knows names, names of the fallen, names of families, names of elders who remembered their grandparents' tales. The guide tells of a woman in gray seen at dusk and of a young man who swore he felt a hand on his shoulder on the anniversary of the battle. You feel the weight of the place, not as a chill on your spine, but as the accumulation of stories, griefs, and acts that make landscapes speak. We still don't know whether any of these apparitions correspond to repeatable, material phenomena or whether they are primarily social phenomena, stories that function to hold memory. We still don't know whether the persistence of certain figures in certain spots uncannily maps onto older, pre-contact ritual sites, or whether that connection is the creative work of storytellers seeking depth. The unknown here is not an absence but an open space for meaning. All of these threads, mounds and terraces, a wandering creek, a marked stone, graves that whisper of bodies too large or too different for easy categories, a hollow that hums, lost roads, and the apparitions that gather like breath across the ridges, pull together into a single pattern if we let them. That pattern is not tidy. It is not a narrative in a neat sense but a layered, braided thing, a palimpsest of human attention where each generation writes, erases, and writes again. The emotional payoff of that picture is both quiet and vast. When you stand on a ridge at dawn and the light slices the field into bands, you are not only seeing the physical contours of hill and hollow, you are seeing centuries of choices about where to walk, where to fight, where to bury, and where to believe. The science gives us measures, radiocarbon dates, LIDAR topographies, isotopic ratios, tool-marked micrographs. The myths give us moral mapping, where the community places its heroes, its monsters, and its mourners. Both are essential. Balance and humility are what the landscape requires of us. We must be ready to test bold claims. If someone suggests a meteoritic fragment, then bring isotope labs and metallurgy. If a map seems to show pre-colonial causeways, then sample and date. But we must also be ready to listen, to the old woman who warns her grandchildren away from a hollow, to the diary that records a strange song, to the farmer who remembers a stone that would not be moved. Those human voices are not data in the laboratory sense, but they are evidence of continuity and concern. The best investigations are those that combine the instruments of science with the patience to hear stories. If archaeology teaches us anything here, it is a discipline in humility. Data rarely resolve more than a set of probabilities, and new methods often complicate older certainties. The LIDAR line that revealed terraces might eventually be explained by 18th century plowing. The beads found beside a boulder might one day be chemically traced to a particular shell bed off the Atlantic. The giant bones might be mapped to nutritional and genetic contexts rather than to mythic titans. Each new answer may demystify a piece and yet open two more questions. That is not disappointment, it is invitation. The human impulse to classify and close the book meets the deeper, creative impulse to keep looking. The ground beneath Gettysburg is stubbornly eloquent precisely because it resists a single reading. It keeps out artifacts, it preserves charcoal layers that do not line up on anyone's tidy timeline, and it holds stories that shift to fit the needs of listeners. That mutability is a kind of generosity. It lets us engage with the past as a living thing. In practical terms, this means we should proceed with curiosity and with care. If you are a visitor, treat the land with respect. Step lightly, report finds to local authorities or park archaeologists, and resist the urge to turn a discovery into a souvenir. If you are a researcher, embrace interdisciplinarity, combine geophysics with oral history, LIDAR with ethnography, geochemistry with compassionate consultation of descendant communities. If you are a storyteller, remember that legends are not opposites of facts but relatives. They offer emotional truths that may converge with empirical ones if investigated thoughtfully. Above all, hold both skepticism and wonder. The world needs our tests as much as it needs our imaginations. We will not always find the big, cinematic revelation, no single, lost race, or the sudden emergence of a civilization previously unknown. More often, what we will find are increments of knowledge, a date that nudges a timeline, a trace element that reveals a trade route, a groove whose microstratigraphy shows repeated touches. Those increments accumulate. They change meanings slowly, like the way centuries of footsteps compress a swale into a road. The real payoffs may be smaller than the grand myths but more resonant, learning how people in different eras used a ridge, how trade reached inland in surprising ways, how grief keeps places alive, how rocks and compasses can be stubborn witnesses to processes both planetary and human. So what should you take away from these fields, these stones, these hollows and graves and laneways? First, that history is not a single thread but an interlaced cloth. When you pull one thread you may not unravel the whole, but you will feel the weave. Second, that mystery is a productive condition, it invites more careful work rather than a premature end to inquiry. Third, that respect for context, archaeological, ecological, and ethical, is the only honest way to engage a landscape that belongs, in various ways, to many peoples across time. Keep your curiosity sharp and your hands clean, metaphorically and literally. Keep listening to elders and to instruments, to myths and to lab reports. Keep asking why certain places feel different, and test those feelings with data. And finally, keep the work communal. Scholars, landowners, tribal nations, local historians, park managers, and visitors all have roles to play. Each perspective adds a strand to the cloth. We will continue to find odd stones and odd data, to reclassify and reinterpret, to be surprised and occasionally humbled. That is the point. The world resists being fully known because that resistance is where learning begins. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.